humbled. So, who was this story intended for? Well, Jesus told the story. A part of the group to whom he communicated the story were those who trusted in themselves. That means they were confident that through their religious devotion, they were living a life of which God approved. But that confidence, according to what Luke says, produced in them a disdain for other people. They viewed other people with contempt. Okay? So there is a kind of righteousness, according to what Luke says here, that God will not accept. And then there's also a kind of righteousness that will lead, or is evidence of, justification, the fact that God does accept it. So here's the point of the story, and if I had to boil it down, this is what I would say. True righteousness shows up in our attitude towards God and other people. It affects both, right? Isn't that what Jesus said? All the law and the prophets can be summed up in two commands. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. If your religion doesn't translate into loving God and loving others, something is wrong with it. And Jesus told this story to communicate this to a group of people who trusted that, hey, my religion's good. But the problem was their attitude towards God and the way they viewed other people fell short of what Jesus said was most important, right? So is there anybody here that would read the story and say, I've got my eye on the Pharisee. I want to be like him. So the question for us this morning, how do we avoid being like the Pharisee and become more like the tax collector? Well, I want to give the first part of the sermon anyhow to you in a bit different way this morning. And I debated whether or not to go here this morning, but I hope that you'll hear me out, okay? It's been decades since Jeff Foxworthy gave this caricature of life in rural America with his popular jokes that began like this. You may be a what? Yes, thank you. You said it, not me, okay? You may be a redneck if. He started that phrase years ago, back in 1987, when he was performing at a place, listen, that was connected to a bowling alley that had valet parking. It's a bowling alley with valet parking. He was performing, this was early on in his career, he was performing and somebody heckled him from the crowd and called him a redneck while he was performing. And so he looked at the guy and he said, look out the window. You know, for crying out loud, if you've got valet parking at a bowling alley, you might be a redneck. That was his first joke. And then he went back to his hotel room and wrote about 10 more, and then it took off. So I want to give a caricature of Phariseeism this morning, if I can, okay? But I got to tell you, it's not very funny. Right, so here's the first one. You may be a Pharisee if your religion is all about you. Notice that when the Pharisee prayed, he prayed to himself. Now that could mean that he stood off by himself and prayed, and rather than praying to God, he prayed to himself. I don't think that's what it means. I think it means he kind of separated himself from other people, and perhaps he was praying silently to himself, but he was really praying to God. But it was the content of his prayer that's so interesting. Notice how much he talked about himself. I. And then also he looked with others with contempt. So what did he do? He had this contemptible view of other people, and he commended himself to God. That's basically the content of his prayer, the substance of his prayer, both of those two things. It's so ironic, right? In a practice that's really supposed to connect you with God, in that conversation, he made it all about him. You get the idea that when he went to God in prayer, he was trying to enlist God in his service rather than vice versa. And there is a kind of righteousness, I think, that is really all about the person rather than God himself. Maybe it's a religion that makes us feel better or bigger in the eyes of other people, better about ourselves, or carries on the family tradition, or even relieves a guilty conscience. But folks, none of that is righteousness that's acceptable before God.
Amen.
Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 16. If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. True righteousness, listen, grows out of a life that is oriented towards God, and that is a heart issue. True Christian faith is not about turning over a new leaf. It's about transformation. It's about change. And where does that change begin? It begins in the heart. It's about going from death to life. And only God can bring about that transformation. But when he does, the whole trajectory of your life changes, okay? No longer from that point is it about living for you or self-preservation. Now it's about losing yourself in a sense, but finding your life in a relationship with God through Jesus. That is true living. That is what results in true righteousness, okay? Here's the second thing, second character, I would say. You may be a Pharisee if you're glad you're not a Pharisee. This is a righteousness of comparison. And notice what the Pharisee does. He gives thanks to God. God, I give you thanks. And that's a good thing when we are filled with gratitude before God. But then he turns around and he looks at this other guy with contempt. His gratitude was rooted not in a truly grateful heart, but it was rooted in pride, you see. And that's the danger of taking our relationship with God and reducing it to a list of do's and don'ts. And notice exactly, that's exactly what he does. It's all about what he didn't do. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like these adulterers, these tax collectors, these idolaters. I am not like them. I don't do that. What I do is I tithe and, I pray. It's the don'ts and the do's. He reduced his relationship with God down to that. Here's what happens when we do that. We make our relationship with God achievable and manageable. It becomes something we can do, you see. And that stimulates pride in us. So his righteousness led him to believe that he was better than others, and he looked down on others with contempt. He was not like them. And that's a religion of comparison, a righteousness of comparison. I'm looking around at other people, at least I'm not like them. What can we put in the blank? Now, we probably wouldn't look at tax collectors today, even though they're probably not real high on your list. Back in those days, tax collectors were seen as traitors because they would collaborate with the Roman government to exact taxes from their own people. So the Roman government would enlist Jews to help them collect taxes. And they gave them a little leeway. You can not only collect what we ask you to collect, but you can also pad your pocket on top of that with whatever you would like. And so they would often do that. Whatever the tax was, they would add a little bit to it, pad their pocket with it. So they were taking advantage of their own people. They were seen as traitors and thieves. That's how people viewed them. Not as much today, right? But just fill in the blank. I mean, who do you look down on? Who do you say in those moments, boy, I am so glad I'm not like? That's a comparison. One author called it race car obedience. We're moving forward in our relationship with the Lord, right? How do we know how well we're doing? Well, we're looking around us at everybody else. As long as we're doing a little bit better, maybe a step or two ahead of so-and-so, we're doing okay. That's race car obedience, but that is not the kind of righteousness that God is after. It's a prideful heart. Here's what a prideful heart does. A prideful heart will lead us to condone sin. That means approve of sin, like, Lord, I don't need you. I'm going to live life my way. Or here's the other thing. A prideful heart will lead us to condemn sinners. Look down on other people. But we don't want that kind of heart. What we want is the heart of Jesus. And the heart of Jesus was filled with compassion for people. Matthew chapter 9, Jesus looked out on the crowds. And what Matthew said is when he looked out on the crowds, he felt compassion for them. Because when he saw them as sheep that were harassed, sheep without a shepherd. And that word compassion is a pretty descriptive word in the original language. It means to be moved on the inside, to look at their condition and to feel pity, and just to be disturbed almost on the inside over their spiritual condition. That is the kind of attitude we should have as we look outward. That is the kind of attitude that true righteousness produces in a follower of Jesus Christ. They're not led by their sinfulness to condone sin, to agree with the way someone's living, nor to condemn the sinner, but to look with them on compassion, this compassionate heart for other people. Just a few verses later, Luke tells us the story of another man. This one wasn't a religious leader, but he was wealthy, and apparently he was a pretty good guy. I think he too had a righteousness of comparison, because he asked Jesus, "Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Give me something. Well, what is it that you would point to in the word that I can do, that I can accomplish in order to have eternal life? And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? There's nobody good except God." Now, Jesus was not saying I'm not perfect. Jesus was perfect. He was the sinless Son of God. But he was stopping the guy right there, because the guy was defining goodness by something achievable to him. And Jesus was like, "No, stop right there. You got a problem right there in your definition of goodness. There's only one good, and that's God. He's the one that you need to be comparing yourself to, not other people." We don't define righteousness by looking at people around us. We define righteousness by looking to one, and that is to God alone. And the more we look at him, the farther we have to go, right? We'll see. It'll become very clear. I've got to make progress in my relationship with the Lord. It's hard to see that, though, if you're looking at other people. Here's another one. You may be a Pharisee if you're proud of your obedience. What gave one man assurance that he was better than the other? He didn't just look to what he did or didn't do. He also looked at his righteous deeds. And there were two things, really. He fasted twice a week. Fasting under Jewish law was only required around the Day of Atonement. But this guy fasted twice a week. That means he willingly gave up sustenance, willingly gave up food. Typically, fasting was accompanied by prayer, so he was probably praying at the same time. And he did that, and he did it not just once, he did it twice a week, all the time. And then he also tithed. Now, also the law, when it came to tithing, specified certain things that they were to tithe on, but he tithed on every single thing that came in. So he lifted up his obedience. It was that attitude of his towards his obedience. Jesus didn't condemn tithing. He didn't condemn fasting. He didn't say, "No, you got it all wrong." What he was looking at was his heart. It was his own attitude towards what he was doing. So here's a verse that will just shatter that kind of concept of righteousness. Okay, righteousness are the good things that I do by themselves. Here's Galatians chapter 3, verse 10. As many as are of the works of the law, okay, just think about that as your good deeds, okay. As many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them." So if you're looking to your good deeds to make you right with God, according to what Paul says here in Galatians, you are under a curse. And why is that? Because nobody can be perfect like God is. So one commentator reminded, this is not just a story about two guys. This is also a story about the kind of God that accepts us. How does he accept us? What kind of God is he? Is he the kind of God that will say, "Look, on balance, I think you're a pretty good person. And so your righteousness, even though it may not be perfect, it's okay, it's acceptable"? Or is God the kind of God that's holy and just in himself, just intrinsically perfect and pure. And were he to accept any kind of obedience that was less than, he would be compromised. Well, he is that kind of God. He's the perfect, just judge. So a righteousness that doesn't really measure up is not the kind of righteousness that he accepts. And this guy was convinced. It's because of my obedience, you see, my conformity to the law, even going above and beyond what God asks. That is what's going to make me acceptable before God. And his heart was just pumped up. So I think there's something here for us. If we think that in any way what we do is going to earn points with God, then your God is not the God of the Bible. The Pharisees' God was not the God of the prodigal son. So what made the tax collector justified? Justified means to be clean, right? Right with God forever. Jesus' words contain the answer. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So I think we can look at two things. When we shift gears now, we look away from the Pharisee and we look to the tax collector. What made the tax collector acceptable before God? One, he saw his need. He saw his need. The language is telling, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. There's a definite article there in the original language, the sinner, not a sinner, as if I'm the worst. And how did he sense that? By looking around him? Well, maybe for a good part of his adult life, he had been condemned. He had heard that and knew that. But I think really he saw himself for what he really was, and that was spiritually needy. Lord, I am before you. I'm guilty. Just me, I'm guilty. And that's exactly what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That means poverty of spirit. That means before God recognizing, Lord, I'm a sinner. And even though on balance I might be better than some other people, I am deeply in need of your mercy. I think this guy recognized what really, when we step back and look at it in terms of a relationship between God and his sinful people, true faith will bring to the surface. And that is the realization that on part, some of us, morally speaking, will be better than others. But when it comes to God's holiness, nobody's even getting close, right? So, whatever the athletic competition is, whether it's a long jump, or when I was in high school, I was not really a great athlete, but I was on the track team and I did the long jump for a little while. And so we would have to practice. We'd, get our steps in, and you got to time your steps just right before your foot hits the line. You can't go over the line, or you'll be disqualified for that particular jump. And so you have to time your steps just right, and then plant your foot, get your momentum carried forward, get your feet out in front of you. When your feet hit the sand, and that momentum carrying you forward will give you some length when it comes to jumping. And there are folks that do this for a living, and they make a lot of money doing this, some athletes and even some Olympians setting all kinds of Olympic records that would just blow your mind how far they can jump, right? So there are some out there that can jump a really long way, and then there are some of us that, boy, it's going to be everything we can just to get our shoes on in the morning. But if you line all those folks up, athletes included, and some of us, ordinary people, line us up along the coast and say, now, on the count of 3, all of us, let's jump to Hawaii. 1, 2, 3. All right, some are going to be able to jump a few feet farther than others, but nobody's coming anywhere close to Hawaii. And you know, the same thing is true in our relationship with the Lord. There are going to be some that maybe live a more moral life than others, but really when it comes to God's holiness, nobody comes anywhere close. And this tax collector understood his own need, and he was broken before God because of his own spiritual condition. I want you to listen to this letter, this excerpt of a letter from a father to a son. It's penned over 200 years ago. The language is a little different, but I think you'll get the point. Listen. He wrote this on the occasion of his own 70th birthday. I am this day 70 years old, a monument of divine mercy and goodness. Though on a review of my life, I find much, very much, for which I ought to be humbled in the dust. My direct and positive sins are innumerable. My negligence in the Lord's work has been great. I've not promoted his cause, nor sought his glory and honor as I ought. Notwithstanding all this, I am spared till now, and am still retained in his work, and I trust I am received into the divine favor through him. Who would write such a thing? This was written by William Carey to his son. In 1793, Carey went to India, and God used him in tremendous ways to lay the groundwork for what we consider to be the modern missions movement. A man that was painfully aware of his inadequacies and his sin before God and was dependent on him. Jerry Bridges wrote a book entitled The Discipline of Grace, and he said in the book that Christians have a need for two things. One, a need for a humble realization of our own sinfulness, and two, a need for a grateful acceptance of God's grace. So we need to be humble, realizing our own need, and then we also need to realize that we have to accept God's grace. What happens without those two things? Well, I think it leads us to float in one of two directions. Okay, if you don't have these things, you will either go in the direction of a relentless